Hello everyone, thanks very much for inviting me to speak today. You can see here a detail from the Attainment Tapestry which is on display upstairs in the gallery. This is Sir Galahad and the Holy Grail. Between 1907 and 1980, the city of Birmingham acquired 6 tapestries illustrating the story of the search for the Holy Grail by the Knights of the Round Table. They were produced by Morris & Co. for 3 different clients over a period of 5 years from 1895 to 1900. Collectively, they are the most coherent and complete surviving representation of this series, which was conceived by William Morris and Edward Burne-Jones and is widely regarded as one of the outstanding achievements of the British arts and crafts movement. In terms of William Morris's personal ambition, the Holy Grail tapestries represent both the culmination of his long-standing desire to revive the art of tapestry weaving and the pinnacle of his artistic collaboration with his close friend. In this talk, I'll consider some of the historical precedents which inspired Morris and his approach to setting up a tapestry workshop, the original commission which led to the creation of the Holy Grail tapestries, and I'll place the Attainment, currently on loan here in Oxford, within the context of Birmingham's collection and the full narrative series, and consider the provenance of some of these later weavings, which give us an insight into some of Morris & Co.'s clients. I'll also outline the materials, techniques, and processes used to produce the tapestries. In his essay on textiles in 1888, Morris wrote, "The noblest of the weaving arts is tapestry, in which there is nothing mechanical. It may be looked upon as a mosaic of pieces of colour made up of dyed threads. The first thing to be considered in the designing of tapestry is the force, purity, and elegance of the silhouette of the subjects represented, and nothing vague or indeterminate is admissible. Depth of tone, richness of colour, and exquisite graduation of tints are easily to be obtained in tapestry, and it also demands that crispness and abundance of beautiful detail, which was the especial characteristic of fully developed medieval art." This is a wool and silk Mille tapestry made in Flanders in about 1500, which is in the Victoria and Albert Museum collection. Morris had developed expert knowledge of medieval tapestries by travelling throughout northern France, viewing examples in cathedrals and collections throughout the 1850s, and undertaking extensive studies in the 1870s. He advised the South Kensington Museum, now the V&A, on acquisitions for their collection. Traditionally, this type of heavy, hand-woven fabric depicting decorative and historic scenes was a major element of domestic interiors, both in terms of scale and financial investment. In Europe, centres of production like Arras and Lille in France and Brussels in Belgium were established from the 12th century onwards. Tapestries provided warmth, decoration, and were a practical form of wall covering, which could be rolled and moved relatively easily. However, this tradition had declined by the end of the 18th century as fashion and taste changed. And there was a growing preference for patterned wallpaper or for hanging pictures on plainer walls. So this is one example of the type of late medieval tapestries which Morris particularly admired and which would have influenced his approach. A verdure is a type of tapestry in which all or most of the pattern consists of leaves or trees, often with animals and flowers added. A Mille, or 1,000 flowers, is a related type of pattern which developed in France and Flanders and was common in the late Middle Ages. It depicted many different European flowers with botanical accuracy, either on their own or as a background for figurative designs. This is another Flemish tapestry, wool and silk, made in the early 16th century, also from the V&A's collection. And this one depicts 3 figures of the Fates triumphing over the fallen body of Chastity against a floral background. Characteristically, Morris first taught himself to weave tapestry using an 18th century French instruction manual on a loom set up in his own home. He's said to have spent 500 hours creating his first work, Acanthus and Vine. Tapestry production necessarily requires a large space, so it wasn't until the move to Merton Abbey in 1881 that he set up a workshop with 3 looms and began training apprentices based on the model of a medieval workshop. His first apprentice was John Henry Durrell, who was to become the workshop supervisor, textile designer, and Morris's ultimate successor. All the weavers were young boys whom Morris thought had small, flexible fingers, and he chose to adopt the haute lisse or high warp method, which was used in Arras and other medieval centres, which meant that the warp threads were arranged vertically rather than horizontally, so there was no limit on the width of the work produced. The weavers sat behind the loom and wove the design sideways, so the tapestry gradually wound on to form a roll along the base of the loom as it was created. So for about the first 10 years at Merton, designs were either adapted from designs that Burne-Jones had already produced for stained glass or were commissioned directly from him, and they tended to be single or grouped figures on a floral background and sometimes conceived in pairs. This is the figure of Pomona, this version woven about 1900, again in Victoria and Albert Museum's collection, wool and silk on a cotton warp, and originally designed by Burne-Jones in 1882. And this was the first design that Burne-Jones produced for Morris & Co., which was specifically intended for tapestry. And you can see it combines a strong silhouette with dense detail, clearly inspired by late medieval precedents. In 1890, a major commission from William Knox Darcy to decorate and furnish his entire home, Stanmore Hall in Middlesex, provided Morris with the opportunity to realise his goal of creating a narrative series of tapestries on a grand scale. Morris was ambivalent about the client, who was extremely rich, having made his money through gold mining in Australia and establishing the oil industry in the Middle East, and he was disparaging about the architectural style of the house. However, he and Burne-Jones visited and chose the dining room as the backdrop for realising the quest for the Holy Grail. Their literary source was Thomas Marley's Le Morte d'Arthur, written in the 15th century. It was reprinted in 1817, and a copy was discovered by Burne-Jones in a bookshop in New Street in Birmingham in 1855. He couldn't afford to buy it at the time, so Morris bought it for him, and it was a book which they both cared about passionately, and they returned to it as a subject matter for their work throughout their lives. In the comradeship of the knights and their heroic quest, they saw an allegory for their own artistic endeavours. Knox Darcy paid Morris & Co. a fee of £3,500 for 10 tapestries, £1,000 of which went to Burne-Jones for his designs. And to give you some kind of comparison, in the late 19th century, a middle-class household of 2 adults and 2 children with at least 1 servant could have been run on an income of between £300 and £500 a year. These are images of the dining room at Stanmore Hall from the Studio magazine in 1899. And this one shows the summons, the first narrative subject, with the verdure tapestries below it. It's helpful to understand the context of the original commission, woven between 1892 and 1895, as the scale and design of the tapestries and the subsequent versions derive from the dimensions of this room and the particular placing of the windows, the chimney breast, and the built-in serving tables that ran along one wall. They were conceived as a narrative series of 6 to be hung between the cornice and the dado rail, and below 4 of the narrative subjects was a verdure tapestry with a banner-style inscription that described the sequence of events taking place above. The figurative tapestries were therefore originally intended to be viewed from below and hung nearly 2 metres above the ground. So this is the arming and departure with verdures below. This is the failure of Sir Lancelot with a verdure below. And this is the attainment with serving tables, and you can see how it's been created in such a way to accommodate the door directly below. None of the tapestries in Birmingham's collection are from this original set. This verdure, however, is from Birmingham's collection, and it was commissioned in 1900, adapted from Morris's original designs by J.H. Durrell after Morris's death. It's an amalgam of those that hung below the narrative subjects originally, and the banner reads as an introduction to the overall story and main characters. The shields were the only element of the series that Morris designed himself, with the devices derived from 2 16th century French texts that he consulted in the British Museum, and each one represents a different knight. Sir Gawain's the double-headed eagle, Sir Lancelot's the red diagonal stripes on a white background, and Sir Galahad's the red cross on a white background are prominently displayed. This is the Knights of the Round Table summoned to the quest by the strange damsel. Burne-Jones's design shows a damsel appearing before King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, summoning them to undertake the quest for the Holy Grail. The Grail was the vessel that Christ drank from at the Last Supper, and was also said to have been used by Joseph of Arimathea to catch Christ's blood at the crucifixion. The main characters who feature later are Sir Lancelot, who raises his hand on the far left, and Sir Gawain, who wears the blue robe and seated on the right. In 1898-99, another set of narrative panels was woven for George McCulloch, who was a colleague of Knox Darcy's, for his house in Kensington in London. And this summons is from that set, acquired by Birmingham Museums in 1980. This is the arming and departure of the knights, and is the second narrative panel which depicts the ladies of King Arthur's court assisting the knights in preparation for their quest. On the far left, Queen Guinevere hands Sir Lancelot his shield, which is an allusion to their adulterous relationship, which was the cause of Lancelot's impending failure. Sir Gawain, who will also fail in the quest, appears mounted on the right of the picture with his shield bearing a double-headed eagle. And the costumes are loosely based on those of the 12th century and were probably taken from Henry Shaw's Dresses and Decorations of the Middle Ages, which was a popular source book on historical costume. So this version of the Arming and Departure is one of 3 of the Holy Grail tapestries, which were commissioned from Morris & Co. by Lawrence Hodson for the drawing room of his home, Compton Hall, which is near Wolverhampton. They were the second weaving of the subject and were on the looms directly after the original set for Knox Darcy was finished, so from 1895 to 96, just within Morris's own lifetime. And all 3 are now in Birmingham's collection, acquired by public subscription in 1907. Hodson had inherited a prosperous Wolverhampton brewery from his father and became a major patron of the arts and crafts movement and of Morris in particular, and he commissioned Morris & Co. to decorate his house and owned a full set of volumes produced by the Kelmscott Press. He's thought to have fallen into financial difficulty due to his investment in collecting and had to sell his collection and the hall in 1906. A handwritten and bound book in our history files lists all the 250 local subscribers who purchased these 3 tapestries for Birmingham's collection for £1,000 in 1907. There's also some interesting contemporary correspondence from Whitworth Wallace, who was the museum's first keeper of the gallery, about the relative merits of the different versions of the tapestries. He argues that Morris personally supervised the production of these 3, being one of the last projects he worked on before he died in 1896, and that in quality they surpassed the Stanmore series and the McCulloch series which followed. Hodson's relationship with Morris himself as a client of Morris & Co. contrasts with that of Knox Darcy. Hodson was a friend, and Wallace writes he, Morris, would never have allowed Mr. Hodson to have had anything but the very best. This is the failure of Sir Gawain. The quest for the Holy Grail was a moral and spiritual journey framed by Christian teachings as well as a demonstration of bravery and physical strength. Mallory's text tells the story of individual knights and their various encounters, fighting or befriending other knights and saving maidens. These events often culminate in symbolic visions or dreams, and only the purest characters are worthy of attaining the Grail. Significantly, Burne-Jones chose to focus on moments of failure for the middle panels. These 2 knights, Sir Gawain and Sir Owain, failed in their quest because they had led sinful lives, and this scene shows them being prevented from entering a ruined chapel by an angel. The brilliant light shining from within is said to suggest the presence of the Holy Grail. So this is another one of the 3 tapestries which were commissioned by Lawrence Hodson for Compton Hall. This subject is the failure of Sir Lancelot, and it's the only one which is not in Birmingham's collection. So this is in a private collection, but from the same series commissioned by George McCulloch as the Summons, which I showed earlier on in Birmingham's collection. Again, Burne-Jones' design shows the failed knight outside a chapel looking as if he's fallen asleep, exhausted, as a bright light shines from within, and an angel stands in the doorway, preventing his entry. The surrounding forest is dark and sinister as a metaphor for the knight's moral and spiritual state. Lancelot was said to be the strongest and most blessed of all the knights until he betrayed King Arthur with his love for Queen Guinevere. This is the ship, and originally this design was intended to fill an awkward space in the corner of the dining room at Stanmore Hall, hence its different size and shape. This specific tapestry in Birmingham's collection was commissioned in 1900 by Mary Middlemore, along with the verdure, which I showed earlier on. It's an appropriate subject for the penultimate story panel. Ships were often used in medieval and classical sources, as a narrative device to transport characters from one scene or world to another, and they became a common visual motif of the arts and crafts movement. In Malory's text, the knights travelled by ship for part of their journey from Britain to Sarras, where the Grail was to be found. Thomas Middlemore was a successful leather manufacturer based in Birmingham who retired to Hoy in the Orkney Islands. The Middlemores were members of progressive circles in Birmingham and patrons of the arts and crafts, and their home, Mille House, was designed by the architect W.R. Letherby. And Mrs. Middlemore, who was a keen embroiderer, exhibited at arts and crafts exhibitions and knew May Morris, William Morris's daughter. May Morris described Mille House as a sort of fairy palace on the edge of the Great Northern Sea, and this tapestry is thought to have been hung in the hallway. It was part of a group of tapestries which were donated to the museum by Mrs. Middlemore's daughter in 1947. So this is the attainment, the vision of the Holy Grail. And this final scene depicts the three successful knights, Sir Bors, who's standing, Sir Percival, who's kneeling, and Sir Galahad, who is the son of Sir Lancelot, and the purest knight who was destined to attain the Grail. And he's kneeling at the altar in front of the chalice, surrounded by symbolic white lilies. Three standing angels hold symbols of Christ's passion, referring to the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection, and to the sacrament of communion, and three more kneel behind the Grail. Above it, a Pentecostal wind indicates the presence of the Holy Spirit, and drops of blood fall from it into the Grail, which is another reminder of Christ's passion on the cross. So this was the third of the tapestries commissioned by Lawrence Hodgson for Compton Hall in 1895 to 96. All of the tapestry designs incorporate the dense floral background inspired by Mille Fleur tapestries, which were added to Burne-Jones designs by J.H. Durrell. Knox Darcy's gardener at Stanmore Hall is said to have identified all of the flowers, which are based on over 30 different native British plants, some of which would have grown locally on the banks of the River Wandle, which ran past Merton Abbey. And William Morris is said to have picked fresh flowers and given them to the weavers for reference. The process by which the designs were conceived, the various elements combined and then transferred to the loom, was a complex one with several stages. In tapestry weaving, designs are formed by filling threads, which are interlaced back and forth through the warp threads only where required, rather than running completely across the full width of the fabric. All of these Holy Grail tapestries are made up of a cotton warp with wool and silk weft threads, and some use of mohair and camel hair. And there are 14 warp threads to the inch. These different types and colours of yarn were wound onto bobbins, which hung down at the back of the work. The shiny reflective silks have been used to great effect for depicting shimmering light, rich fabrics, armour and other highlights, and the coarser animal hair adds texture for the coats of the deer and the horses, for example. As well as providing more space, the facilities at Merton Abbey and the river nearby also gave Morris increased control over the dyeing process, and all the colours are derived from natural dyes which would have been produced on the premises. This is a detail of the back of the Summons tapestry in Birmingham's collection, showing the strange damsel. 3 weavers could work alongside each other at the loom at any one time, and they sat behind the warp threads and wove sideways. Opposite them were mirrors which reflected their progress from the front, and they had to turn to see large cartoons of the designs for reference. The names of the first 9 individual weavers who were trained by Morris and Durrell are known, and 7 of them continued to work on the 3 tapestries for Hodgson. W. Sleeth and W. Knight were said to be the best, who, with assistance from J. Martin, did most of the flesh tints. In an interview for Studio magazine in 1894, Morris referred to the weavers as, both by nature and training, artists, not merely animated machines, and stated that they had scope to choose the arrangement of tints in shading. However, the level of consistency between the different versions of the tapestries is incredibly high and could be seen to suggest that this was relatively limited in practice. So these tapestries are currently backed, so you can't see the actual construction of the fabric, but these fascinating details were in our history files, and this is the side that the weavers would have been working from, and you can see how the design is essentially reversed, with the ends of the work threads being visible. This is another detail showing Sir Gawain and the others seated around the table. And this one shows the bottom of the chairs and the floral foreground. There are many drawings and studies surviving in public and private collections relating to the Holy Grail tapestries, but it's not always entirely clear which part of the process of production they relate to. They include rough composition sketches, studies of individual heads and figures, more finished drawings with body colour, and larger photographic cartoons. One of Burne-Jones' sketchbooks in Birmingham's collection dates from about 1890 to 91 and shows some of his initial ideas and sketches relating to the series. It's full of visual references to historical precedents, including Byzantine architecture, dress, and decorative detail. This is a sketch of the chalice from the sketchbook and relates directly to elements in the attainment, like several of the sketches in this book. And this drawing is of a specific historic chalice which was used as the model for the Holy Grail. And this is an early study of a boat, one of several in the book, which has been translated eventually into the ship tapestry. And this is a study for the summons, which is pencil, chalk, wash and body colour. And for the first stage of the Morris & Co. commission, Burne-Jones would have produced drawings that were about 30 centimetres high, which showed the overall composition. This study from Birmingham's collection is similar to Morris's description of these preliminary designs as having little minuteness of detail and being only slightly tinted. And finally, this is a study for the attainment from about 1890 to 91, which is watercolour with body colour, gum and gold paint over traces of pencil. And this study shows a much later stage with more detail and colour included, but the foreground details of the flowers and other elements that would have been added by J.H. Durl later are missing at this stage. A contemporary account by Bence-Jones describing the process for the original client, Knox Darcy, refers to original scale drawings being made by Burne-Jones, from which J.H. Durl then made reduced drawings with colours. These were returned to Burne-Jones for comment or alteration, and then the drawing was photographed and enlarged, mounted on stretchers, and returned to Burne-Jones, who again added some slight details. Bence-Jones writes, "When returned to the Abbey works, the foreground and background details were put in by Mr. J.H. Durl from his own drawings. The flowers and accessories throughout were added at this stage, and this was done on a tracing of the original returned by Mr. Burne-Jones." So the weavers were given the original drawing and Durl's tracing and combined both into a complete tracing, and the completed cartoon was placed against the warp threads, and the outlines of the design were retraced onto the warp threads using Indian ink. The working cartoons with colours were placed behind the weavers so as not to block the light in front of them, which is why they would have been turning sideways to refer to them. Tapestries continued to be produced by Morris & Co. after Morris and Burne-Jones had died, and well into the 20th century. After the third weaving for George McCulloch, and presumably after the Middlemore Commission as well, the original client, Knox Darcy, bought the working cartoons from Morris & Co. to prevent any further versions being created. However, after his death in 1917, his widow sold them back again. The workshop closed in 1917 due to the majority of weavers being called up during the First World War, but then it reopened in the 1920s, and two late versions of the summons and the attainment were produced in 1932, and the workshop lasted until the final closure of the business in 1940. So I hope this will have given you some sense of the significance of the tapestries in Birmingham's collection. Together, they are the most complete representation of the series and the only set in a public collection. And all of them will be going on display in the Love Is Enough exhibition when it moves to Birmingham and opens at Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery in April. Thank you.